At 6:40 a.m., Moscow froze, minus 18 degrees Celsius, wind gusts at 35 kilometers per hour, and more than 7,000 heavy trucks locked in place. On the federal M4 Don Highway, a 1,517-kilometer artery feeding southern Russia, traffic stopped completely. Steel-ton vehicles slid backward on icy inclines, engines stalled, cargo sat motionless, drivers abandoned cabs and walked. On the M7 highway, queues stretched 5 kilometers outside the capital. Fuel tankers, food carriers, medical supplies, all trapped. In Moscow, a city of 13 million, access roads turned into parking lots. In St. Petersburg, over 100 trucks jammed outside a single distribution center, carrying hundreds of tons of food that never reached shelves. Residents filmed themselves pushing freight trucks by hand, boots slipping on frozen asphalt. This was not a storm. This was not an accident. This was systemic failure. Within hours, logistics costs spiked by up to 40% on key routes. Supermarket managers warned of empty shelves within 24 to 48 hours. Milk cartons were locked behind plastic barriers. Prices jumped again. Social media filled with panic. Every stalled truck triggered a chain reaction. No deliveries, no restocking, no trust. And here is the critical detail. None of this happened on a battlefield. This collapse unfolded in Russia's largest cities, far from the front lines. The war had arrived somewhere else. It had entered kitchens, pharmacies, and bank cards. And then the unthinkable happened. The trucks did not move again. What unfolded on Russia's highways was not random chaos. It was the collision of war, economics, and geography. Russia's logistics system is built on trucks, not rail, not rivers. Trucks move most food, medicine, and consumer goods across a country spanning 11 time zones. When those trucks stop, the system seizes. The M4 and M7 highways are not ordinary roads. They are strategic corridors. The M4 links Moscow to Voronezh, Rostov-on-Don, and Krasnodar, supplying southern industrial zones and military rear bases. The M7 connects the capital to the Volga region and Tatarstan, feeding factories, refineries, and logistics hubs. Blocking these routes isolates entire regions within hours. This matters because Russia is fighting a long war that demands constant movement. Ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, all rely on civilian logistics networks. Military doctrine assumes civilian transport will absorb the strain. That assumption is now breaking. Since 2022, sanctions have limited access to Western spare parts, tires, gearboxes, electronics. At the same time, war mobilization drained the labor pool. Tens of thousands of drivers were pulled into uniform or left the sector. Fuel prices climbed, insurance costs rose, freight rates surged, but profits did not. The contrast is brutal. Cheap drones versus multi-million-dollar tanks. Sanctioned spare parts versus frozen highways. A global energy exporter unable to move bread. Russia once claimed logistics superiority through scale. Big territory, big reserves, big fleets, but size cuts both ways. Longer routes mean higher costs. Extreme weather magnifies every weakness. When winter hits, inefficiency turns lethal to supply chains. Historically, Russian power relied on endurance, outlasting rivals through mass and depth. But modern logistics rewards speed and precision, not brute volume. The war accelerated that mismatch. By early 2025, freight companies were already failing. Industry data showed the largest wave of transport bankruptcies in 17 years. Vehicles were repossessed by the tens of thousands. Fleets shrank. Maintenance stopped. Cannibalization began. So when the cold locked the highways, there was no buffer, no reserve capacity, no redundancy. This was not weather defeating Russia. It was structural decay finally exposed. And once decay surfaces, escalation follows. The paralysis did not arrive in one blow. It unfolded in waves. First came delays, then came queues, then came abandonment. On the outskirts of Moscow, drivers waited 12, 24, then 48 hours without unloading. Fuel ran low. Engines were shut off to save diesel. Cabins dropped below freezing. Some drivers simply walked away, leaving vehicles frozen mid-lane. Social media footage spread fast. Residents filmed themselves pushing 40-ton trucks uphill with bare hands. Horns blared, tempers snapped. Police units were overwhelmed, unable to reroute traffic that had nowhere to go. Twist 1 arrived quietly. Distribution centers stopped accepting cargo. In St. Petersburg, the Perekrestokh hub closed its gates. Over 100 trucks sat outside, carrying hundreds of tons of food. Contracts expired while vehicles waited. Perishable goods spoiled inside sealed trailers. Losses mounted by the hour. Twist 2 followed. Freight prices exploded. On routes like Moscow to St. Petersburg and Omsk to Novosibirsk, transport fees surged so high that operators refused new orders. It became cheaper to park a truck indefinitely than to move it. By midweek, logistics firms reported cost increases exceeding 40%, wiping out already thin margins. Then came the third twist: industrial cannibalism. With spare parts unavailable, companies dismantled idle trucks to keep one vehicle operational. Gearboxes were swapped, brake systems removed. One truck survived at the expense of another. This was not maintenance, it was triage. As fleets shrank, the backlog deepened. Every missing truck delayed another delivery. Every delay amplified shortages. Supermarkets began rationing. Milk and baby formula were locked behind plastic barriers. Prices rose again. Public reaction shifted from frustration to fear. Russians posted receipts showing grocery bills equal to a month's income. Store closures spread. Small businesses folded within days. Meanwhile, the blockage crept outward. Border crossings clogged, warehouses filled, factories waited. At the Kazakhstan-Russia crossings of Sirim and Mashtakovo, trucks lined up for weeks. By January 2026, weather and sanctions froze the Upper Lars corridor entirely, halting trade flows from the south. What began as traffic chaos became a national supply seizure. The war economy consumed transport capacity, leaving civilians exposed. Military logistics pulled fuel and vehicles from civilian use, tightening the chokehold. This was escalation without missiles, pressure without explosions, a silent strangulation. And the system kept tightening itself. The consequences rippled far beyond traffic jams. They struck the core of Russia's economy, society, and military power. Start with the numbers. Russia's civilian transport sector moves goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. When freight costs jump by 30 to 40%, that increase does not stay on highways. It flows straight into prices. Food inflation, already elevated, accelerated again. Analysts tracking consumer baskets saw basic staples rise week by week, not month by month. Every stalled truck translated into empty shelves 24 to 48 hours later. Economic outlets including Reuters and BBC reported that logistics disruptions were becoming one of the fastest drivers of inflation pressure inside Russia. The effect was asymmetric. Wealthier urban residents absorbed the shock. Lower income households could not. Demand collapsed in some sectors while panic buying spiked in others. Industry followed. Factories waiting for raw materials halted production lines. Steel plants in the Urals delayed output without ore deliveries from Siberia. Textile manufacturers near Moscow lacked southern cotton shipments. Finished goods piled up, unable to reach ports or domestic distributors. This fed directly into GDP performance. Russia's growth narrative, already strained by sanctions, took another hit. Economists cited logistics paralysis as a hidden contraction force, one that official statistics struggled to capture. Then came the military impact. Russian doctrine relies on civilian transport integration. Trucks that deliver groceries in peacetime move ammunition in war. When thousands of transport firms entered bankruptcy or liquidation, the military lost access to that reserve pool. Defense analysts interviewed by outlets such as Defense News and Jane's noted a dangerous feedback loop. Units at the front waited longer for supplies. Delays increased consumption inefficiencies. More pressure fell on fewer vehicles. Wear accelerated. Breakdowns multiplied. Every hour of delay at the rear echoed forward. Social stability weakened alongside logistics. When citizens cannot buy affordable food, state messaging loses credibility. Locked milk cartons became symbols of scarcity. Trust eroded. Panic replaced reassurance. The Kremlin faced a dilemma: divert resources back to civilians and risk military strain, or continue prioritizing the front and deepen domestic pressure. So far, the balance favored the war, but that choice carries cost. Bankrupt transport firms meant lost jobs. Lost jobs meant lower tax intake. Lower revenue squeezed regional budgets already strained by mobilization and subsidies. This was not collapse from a single shock. It was erosion from every direction. Logistics had become the weakest link. And in modern conflict, the weakest link decides outcomes. This crisis did not stay inside Russia, it radiated outward. NATO planners watched closely. Logistics is the hidden metric of power, and Russia's weakness was becoming visible without satellite imagery. When trucks fail, armies slow. When costs spike, endurance shrinks. Western defense analysts contrasted two models: Russia's heavy centralized system, Ukraine's adaptive decentralized one. Cheap drones costing $500 to $2,000 disrupted platforms worth $10 million. Now cheap weather and inflation were immobilizing logistics worth billions. The pattern was clear: asymmetric pressure works. In Brussels, EU officials quietly recalibrated risk models. A Russia struggling to move food internally has less leverage abroad. Energy exports still matter, but infrastructure decay reduces reliability. Buyers price that risk. China took a colder view. Beijing values predictability. When Russian deliveries slow or miss deadlines, alternatives emerge. Australian minerals, Middle Eastern energy, Central Asian routes. Analysts quoted by international outlets noted a subtle shift. Russia was no longer a strategic equal. It was becoming a discounted supplier. That dependence cuts both ways. Components expected from China also sat frozen in truck queues across Siberia. Sanctions plus logistics failure created mutual friction. Cooperation became transactional, not strategic. The United States responded with restraint and calculation. Under President Donald Trump, Washington emphasized cost efficiency and alliance burden sharing. US officials pointed to the contrast between low-cost Ukrainian systems and Russia's expensive inefficiencies, framing it as proof of doctrinal failure. The Middle East watched for different reasons. Russia's reduced logistics capacity limited its ability to project influence through arms deliveries and energy coordination. Delays weaken credibility in markets that value reliability over rhetoric. Now the scenarios. Over the next 3 to 6 months, analysts see three paths. First, partial stabilization. The Kremlin injects subsidies, prioritizes key routes, and restores limited flow. This slows the bleed but raises fiscal pressure. Second, managed decline. Logistics continues degrading unevenly. Core cities survive, regions suffer. Inflation becomes chronic. Third, cascading failure. Another shock, weather or sanctions, overwhelms remaining capacity. Production stalls widen, social pressure intensifies. None of these favor rapid recovery. The deeper issue is structural. Modern warfare rewards mobility, redundancy, and flexibility. Russia's system was built for volume and control. That mismatch is now global knowledge. Allies, rivals, and markets have adjusted their expectations. And once expectations shift, power follows. What began as frozen trucks became something far larger. A stress test, a revelation. Russia's highways exposed the limits of its war economy, not through explosions, but through silence. Engines stalled, supply chains seized, prices climbed, trust evaporated. This was not a single failure, it was layered. Sanctions restricted parts, mobilization drained labor, inflation crushed margins, winter removed the last illusion of resilience. Together, they halted movement across a country of 145 million people. The symbolism matters. Empires move on logistics. When movement stops, power becomes theoretical. Locked supermarket shelves carried more strategic weight than any speech. The military felt it. Delays at the rear translated into strain at the front. Civilian and military systems, once intertwined, now competed for the same shrinking resources. Globally, the message was received. Allies recalculated, rivals repriced risk, partners hedged. Cheap pressure outperformed expensive force. The crisis also raised questions the Kremlin cannot easily answer. Can a war economy function without civilian stability? Can inflation be controlled when transport collapses? Can power be projected when supply chains fail at home? Most importantly, can a system built on scale adapt to a world that rewards flexibility? The trucks have not moved, the costs keep rising, and the pressure continues. What happens next will not be decided by slogans or statements. It will be decided by whether the wheels start turning again, or whether they stay frozen. What do you think? Will Russia stabilize its logistics network, or will this paralysis deepen? Can the system adapt fast enough, or has a critical threshold already been crossed? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for in-depth geopolitical analysis. Turn on notifications to